A band of strangers in a strange and alien world run, charging headlong into a beckoning darkness, pursued by their would-be masters. 20 of them in total. Most are simple farmers, abducted to be the slave labor of the despotic Duergar. Several denizens of this strange world are among them, also made slaves. Their motives and intentions enigmatic and hostile, but now brought together by circumstance. At the head of this group, 4 unlikely heroes come together to save themselves, these people, and perhaps one day, this whole world. Hello, I'm Andrew Staub, but I've been busy of late. It's been a while since I last posted. Busy with what, you ask? Well, recording and editing our D&D games. And for complex reasons, as I just mentioned, I've been editing them. So this video is going to be a bit lighter on the editing because I want to be able to get back to doing those. This is the first campaign diary where I look at our D&D game over on Dice in the Attic, which is our communal channel, look at what I had prepared, talk about what I expected to happen, and then talk about what actually happened. If you haven't already, please go check it out. There aren't going to be any major spoilers here, so whether you want to go watch that and come back, or go watch that after you finish watching this, you should be fine either way. So the first thing I sort of want to cover is Duergar, not Duergar. And then this sort of goes back to the 90s and even into the 70s, where the designers of D&D want there to be a lot of different interesting monsters to fight. And so what they would do is they would take different mythological creatures, oftentimes the same creature, but simply named differently in different cultures. So like, for example, giant is what we have in, sort of Greek mythology. There are trolls in Norse mythology, ogres in French, Fomorians in the Celtic myths, and they're all essentially synonyms. But in D&D, each one of those different creatures gets its own unique stat block, and they sort of have their own different characterization. Giants are bigger than all of the other ones. Trolls have this sort of interesting resistance to damage, except for fire and acid, and they sort of regenerate health. Ogres are sort of just big, dumb brutes. Fomorians are kind of weird abominations. But in the old original myth, they're all the same thing. So when they were designing this new sort of concept known as the Underdark, they kind of ran into some interesting ideas. So Duergar, dwarves, Duergar, whatever, they're all subvariants of dwarf. And so dwarf originally comes from the Old English word dwerg. Now, Old English is sort of a mixture of Germanic and some amount of romanticized words. But in the Old Norse, it's dvergr, spelled D-V-E-R-G-R, which was the Old Norse word for dwarf. So again, they're mining different mythology, and dvergr is where we get Duergar. Now, Duergar, spelled D-U-E-R-G-A-R. But here's the thing. Duergar is very different from dvergr, but for esoteric reasons beyond my ability to comprehend, they spell it D-U-E-R. But a lot of people, old school gamers, will pronounce it Dwer. Now, if you go on like D&D Beyond, for example, like the Matt Mercer, like the line, voice-acted line that they actually have,
Duergar.
It's pronounced Duergar. Because here's the thing, phonetically, that's how you would pronounce that word, right? I think it's a dumb way to spell that word, just personally. And so I decided for this campaign, and because this is the first time I'm really using many Duergar, that I was actually going to spell it differently. And so the way I spell it is closer to that original Norse. The original Norse DV, right? So I decided DW. D-W-E-R-G-A-R is how I spell Duergar, and I pronounce it Duergar, because I think it's closer to the original Norse, which I like to sort of pay mention to, and I also think it's just a more interesting pronunciation. It's more explicitly similar to dwarf. Since I came up with my own spelling, and I'm also coming up with my own lore, mechanics, stat blocks, etc. So, for example, all of my Duergar belong to these different houses. You get to see one of the houses, House Folgar. They are a particularly, maybe evil's probably the right word for it. They are the slaving house. All of the Duergar practice slavery except for one to some extent or another. But House Folgar is big time slavers. They're sort of the slaver house. But I also made my own stat blocks. Now they're all sort of in the alpha stage of testing, and you do get to see a bit of them in action. And so the players got to see 2 of the different kinds of Duergar. The first is sort of the grunt. They got a pickaxe, and the other one is the Duergar talent. Now, the genesis for a lot of my ideas about this is one thing that just sort of bugs me about Duergar. or Duergar. The way I guess I'll say Duergar refers to the 5th edition, the D&D version. Duergar refers to my version. So my problem with Duergar in 5e, and it's even in some of the older ones, is that they're cool. Their signature ability is I get big. It's enlarge. And I'm sorry, but that's kind of nonsensical. So I'm not saying that there's anything like necessarily practically wrong with that being an ability. No, I'm just saying that that's kind of a really weird ability for the underground subterranean version of dwarves to have, because I get big is actually to my mind, it's a big problem if you're underground. Because what do we think of when we think of underground? Do we think of expansive spaces? Do we think of excessive arm and leg room? I don't. I think of cramped tunnels. And so I get big is actually a liability. And it's sort of illogical in my opinion. Now, mechanically, the way it works is great though, right? You get additional battlefield control. That's nice. Not leave it or take it. But it also does more damage on each of their attacks. And that mechanically is a really great way to have it so that they only make one attack, but that one attack is pretty nasty. So what I instead decided to do is I sort of looked at MCDM's The Talent, which is a 5th edition class. I think it's really cool, and I just sort of mined all of the cool, the cool powers that you get, and I sort of looked through them, and I eventually decided that all of the Duergar have the ability to amplify. So basically, they wreathe their weapon in psionic, purpulescent energy, and they attack, and then it does a bunch of extra damage, and then there's a little feedback. So he's concentrating on this, like this purpulescent energy covers this, his war pick. He smacks into him, and the energy explodes outwards, and then it also like reverberates through him and explodes backwards. Now, I don't think the feedback is going to stick around, so if the players ever fight Duergar again, I think I'm going to cut the feedback, but that's probably going to be how they all die, is I'm going to narrate, because I think it's really interesting. Their brains explode out. It's a very interesting way to my mind, to characterize them. And then the other stat block that the players got to see is the talent. When the players originally saw them, they were like, oh, whatever, it's just the jailers, right? They're dudes in leather armor, they got no weapons, right? They're so meager, these little guys. But actually, they're a lot tougher than the other dudes because they have the ability to psionically do stuff. They don't need weapons, right? Their bodies are weapons. So it's sort of their signature ability is iron, right? Their body turns to iron, increases their armor class. They get to make an additional attack around, and they do these pretty nasty punches. Now, they're a lot tougher than the footmen, but they're still not that tough. They're not like true tanks, because they also have because they're like spellcasters, basically. But I thought that was a really interesting transformation, and I think it makes a lot more sense than I get big, and I fill the entire tunnel. Sorry, guys, now you guys have to spend extra movement to get around me, to their allies, because they sort of become living weapons. That, to me, that's sort of my idea about Duergar, and that's sort of a brief explanation of why I spell it, why I'm pronouncing it the way I am, why they're different from the normal ones, just sort of my thoughts. The other sort of major thing I want to talk about is NPCs. So my sort of conception of this session was that I was going to put the players in the situation where they're prisoners, right? Now, of course, there's a lot of caveats. You need to be careful when you're doing a prisoner plot, because you want to make it obvious and easy for the players to be able to escape. That was very important to me. So I knew how the players are going to escape. And I wrote that in, and I said, I didn't say it to the players. Some of the NPCs basically said, don't worry, we'll figure a way to get out of here. Let us handle that. It'll figure itself out. So what I sort of expected the players would probably do, foolishly, right? I did not expect the players to literally spend, the entire time just trying to scatterbrain, think about different ways to try to escape, right? Because I didn't explicitly give them the knowledge that, hey, don't worry about it. You'll figure out a way to escape. Really what that setup is to do is it's to introduce these NPCs, have the players start interacting more seriously, get some role-playing in, and try to talk to these NPCs to try to gain some information. And what I conceptually wanted this session to basically be, was the players sort of negotiating with some of these NPCs and determining which of them they like, which of them they trust, which of them they don't trust, and maybe try to negotiate and figure out, hey, which of these NPCs do we want to travel with, right? Because the answer is going to be probably not all of them. Now, they ended up not doing that, and they'd said, and actually one of the NPCs, Zilnar, who we'll talk about briefly, but not too much, The Zilnar tried to leave, but the players were like, no, Zilnar is coming with us. And that really was not what I wanted, because Zilnar was a joke. Zilnar was a joke character, right, originally, pulling back the curtain. Zilnar was not a serious NPC. I've sort of had to backfill in some details about him now. But, Zilnar was a joke. I had some box text written for him, right? He has this great line.
Do not doubt my prowess, for I am Zilnar Rugglefugle.
You made that up. That is not your name.
Right, and that's Zilnar Rugglefugle. Is that? You just got it. There's a little bit more, but not much. Yeah, and so he didn't even have a class, right? By the end of the session, I decided he was a bard because he needed it, because the players sort of forced him to help them out. But I sort of imagined that he would show up in this first session, that he would, based upon the players' interaction with him, that he would leave, and that he would appear later in the adventure, and it would be oh, we remember that NPC, Zilnar Rugglefugle, ha, 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 ha. Such a funny little, quirky little guy. But no, the players were like, no, you are coming with us. And he's like, well, okay. But, he doesn't really want to go with them. But he eventually sort of turned, realized there was some strength in numbers. He's still a goofy character, but, is what it is. So, and sort of the issue was that I sort of misunderstood what the players were probably going to do. It's pretty obvious in hindsight that the players are going to spend the entire session trying to get out of there. And that even after that they're not going to bother talking to these NPCs, because they're like, well, whatever. We'll figure out what we're going to do once we get out of this cage, And it did lead to issues later on, which don't happen in this session, but do happen in the next session, which we'll probably talk about then. But sort of the issue with my approach, with my prep, was there's just way too many NPCs, man. So there's only 5 with speaking parts. So we get Faramond, who's a wizard. He really only got 1 speaking line, and I think in general, I've kind of failed when it comes to Faramond. I haven't provided him enough characterization. It's all right. There are worse sins. If one NPC isn't that interesting, I mean, he's a pretty normal NPC. Edric, who is a sort of fighter, he's basically like Zach's character Ranulph. He's like his squire, basically, at this point. He actually worked out basically as I expected him to, and he's fine. There is the yet unnamed Bugbear and Drow. Both of them, I think, are A+, no notes. I think those characters, great. The players, generally speaking, like them. They like talking to them. They like interacting with them. They've done it a whole lot. They're going to keep doing it a whole lot. Those 2 NPCs, I think, worked out relatively well. And then Zilnar Rugglefugle is sort of a quibble. I expected him that he was going to leave, but he hasn't, and he's probably not going to be able to. So he's just kind of hanging around. He's just kind of there. And then there's a dozen human peasant NPCs, all of whom have names. They're sort of background characters, right? And so maybe it's perfectly fine that they don't really have any characterization. They're peasants. They're a bunch of farmers that were kidnapped, and, especially Ranulph is really like, we're getting those people out of here, right? Those people are not going to die down here, which is pretty interesting on his part. Now, aside from that issue with sort of the player's prioritization not necessarily lining up with my expectation, which, it's not their fault, it's mine, I think the session went pretty great. There wasn't a whole lot in the way of player agency, but that quickly sort of resolves, right, after even to the next session, and the session after that even more so, right? And that's sort of, I think, a thing just with D&D campaigns in general, is there's not generally a ton of great choices for the players right at the beginning, but that sort of improves as the campaign gets along and we sort of get up to, we sort of set up the central plot. This campaign is maybe the most politically sophisticated game I've ever, I like a politically sophisticated game. This game is like insane. It's factions in factions in factions, right? There's one level of factions, there's another level of factions, and then there's a third level of factions, right? So it's just insanity. And even within factions, there are sub-factions. So it's just ludicrous how much political intrigue this game is going to have. We're getting into that slowly, bit by bit. We're sort of introducing some of it, and it's going to get more and more pronounced. There's one other thing that I'd forgotten to do. There was a little handout from the talent from, I think the players called him Skarsgård. They nicknamed him that, the guard with the scar across his face. who was going to have a little paper handout that I was going to hand to them, but I just totally forgot about it. Not a huge deal. It didn't include that much information, but it did sort of hint at something that is set up later. Since people may ask, we did do a session 0 for the campaign, setting up some of the characters and the relationships, and then we did a second session 0. So we did one where I did multiple of the characters together, like twos and a singular, and then we did one where it's everybody. In the one that was everybody, we were setting up this idea of all of the PCs except for Wolfric, which is Caleb's character, were in a coastal town doing sort of normal stuff, and then suddenly a bunch of like Viking dudes, the Gaul, they're my version of Goliaths, raid. They're attacking. And so they're sort of the Gaul is sort of a mix between like Old Norse Vikings mixed with Klingons. Wolfric is a Gaulish warrior, and he and his people are in the middle of raiding this town, and there's a bit of a combat with the PCs, and they actually fight. And so that's sort of setting up that sort of context is missing from the whole thing, but you do really get a sense of the animosity between, or sort of a rivalry maybe between the two fighters in the party, right? And there's 2 fighters in the party. That doesn't happen all the time, right? There's 12 classes. 2 of the players chose the same class. Very different, characterized very differently. So that's sort of a great tension that we're going to see, and we're going to see it continue, and it's going to sort of, the stakes are going to get raised, is all I'm going to say about that. What happened was that they were fighting, and then suddenly a great fissure in the ground opened up, and the PCs and a dozen human NPCs got sucked down into it. And the whole campaign is sort of based on a couple of, I'm sort of basing it basically generally off of the sort of the classical Underdark adventures. Out of the Abyss is some of the inspiration, like especially the setup. Of course, it's Dwergar that captured the PCs and not Drow. The escape is very different. There's a lot more. There's a lot more political interplay, but there's less NPCs. But I think the NPCs are much more characterized in my version of it, and I think that's for the better. Having a handful of well characterized NPCs is a lot easier for the players to handle. Although still, it's maybe 1 or 2 too many NPCs. Not the end of the world. Another adventure that I use a little bit as inspiration is Night Below, although it's here and there. It's less the structure, it's more individual components that I like from Night Below that I'm sort of taking and I'm adapting and I'm modifying it. Again, please head over to Dice in the Attic. It's spelled exactly as you think, it's all one word. And please check it out. We've got the first 2 episodes out as of right now. We've made plans to increase our throughput, and we've actually recorded the first 8 sessions already. And some people have commented on the first episode that the editing was a bit choppy, but the second episode is a lot better in that respect, and I think in general. The third episode is hopefully going to be even better, and it's just going to continue to get better and better as things go on. So please go check that out. Provide any comments on things that you think could be improved, or how you think the campaign is going so far. With that said, I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.